Hi, I'm glad you decided to listen to my little lecture. I keep my promise, and now in this video I will tell you about another myth that is more than 200 years old. I will break your outdated knowledge, with which you have lived, perhaps, all your life. I ask everyone to be patient, because this topic is difficult to understand and requires special attention. I perfectly understand how difficult it is to abandon the usual and look at the thing from a completely different angle, so I ask you not to rush to conclusions. Watch the video to the end. Think well and only then express your reasoned opinion in writing here under the video. I always answer everyone. There is a lot of talk and writing about swarming. And we can even safely say that there is no beekeeper who has not encountered this phenomenon in his practice in his apiary, but, unfortunately, everything that you knew before about swarming has long been outdated, and beekeepers for some reason do not want to notice it. Science cannot stand still. Knowledge will always be updated. Scientists will discover something new, and we must constantly restore order in our attic, and not turn it into a dump of unnecessary and outdated knowledge. I will talk about swarming, and this will help you understand what swarming is, how to properly stop the swarming of bees or avoid it altogether. Beekeepers, regardless of where they live, have historically believed that swarming is the instinct of natural reproduction of bees in the wild. And this is a good sign of the state of affairs of the colony. Now, about 99.9% of beekeepers around the world think so, regardless of their seniority and experience. And this opinion was formed a long time ago, in those very distant times, when there was no such science as biology. People did not know what instinct was. There were no fundamental works of Darwin and Pavlov's experiments. And people themselves came up with a name for this phenomenon and gave them a primitive explanation, based on the everyday perception of that reality. And it couldn't have been any other way then. And how could a simple peasant explain to himself what swarming is? His primitive reasoning was based solely on analogy. For example, he had 10 sheep, and a year later he had 20 of them. What happened to them? It is clear to everyone that they have multiplied. That's exactly how he began to talk about bees. He had 30 log hive, and by the fall he already had 50 of them. What happened to them? Of course, they multiplied naturally, and most importantly, without human intervention, as intended by nature itself. It was the quantitative criterion that was mistakenly taken as the basis of those arguments, and no one then looked at the essence of that process. It is this knowledge that has been passed down from generation to generation. Biologists have already written tons of books. And we all tell ourselves and our children in the old-fashioned way that swarming is a natural instinct for bees to reproduce in nature. And beekeepers should know what swarming really is. Or is it not so important for them? If we take as a basis some false idea about some phenomenon, then all our subsequent reasoning and conclusions will also be false. And it can't be any other way. It is impossible to find the truth by going not just on the wrong path, but in a completely different direction. False ideas give rise to false criteria, and then false actions. Now, every high school student knows that the instinct of reproduction is one of the most stable instincts of all living beings on Earth, on a par with the instinct of self-preservation. It is thanks to them that all living beings on Earth survive. As long as there are instincts in living beings, there will be life on Earth. The instinct of reproduction cannot be somehow suppressed, pushed back or artificially aroused, but we are well aware that veterinarians provide such a service as the sterilization of domestic pets, in particular cats and dogs. Therefore, the instinct of reproduction either exists, or it does not exist at all, and then this species cannot have a continuation of the genus. And if we approach the swarming of bees from this position, then there can be no talk about the fact that swarming can somehow be stopped or even prevented, to sterilize the colony so that it does not swarm at all, or to bring out such a breed of bees that would not swarm at all. There can be no question. But beekeepers know for sure that in some cases they can successfully bring a colony out of the swarm state. And if the beekeeper wants, he can easily bring any colony into the swarm state. This just convincingly suggests that swarming is not an instinct of natural reproduction of bees. Despite all the secondary signs of this instinct, if swarming is not a breeding instinct, then what is it? For more than 20 years, I have perceived swarming not as an instinct of natural reproduction of bee colonies, but as an instinct of self-preservation. I built all the cause and effect relationships in the swarming and came to the conclusion that the swarm state is a sure sign of some kind of trouble in the colonies. And the process of swarming itself is a mechanism for saving the colonies from imminent death in winter. Moreover, the more severe the local living conditions of this breed of bee, the more demanding it should be to the condition of its existence in the summer. Any failure in the activities of the colonies in the summer should trigger this mechanism to prevent trouble. Therefore, the stronger the swarming instinct, the higher the chances of survival of this colonies in the winter. The whole meaning and motivation of the swarming process is simple, and it has worked successfully for many millions of years, and it is thanks to swarming that the bees have survived to this day. If the colonies in these conditions has entered the swarm state, then this indicates that the colonies is experiencing some great inconvenience, which ultimately threatens it with death in the winter. And there is only one way out in such a situation. It urgently needs to change its conditions, change its location. And in such a situation, there can be only one way out to change the place of residence of the whole colonies. But this is a big risk for the colonies. To take and fly away with the whole colonies is not known where. And what will be the new conditions there? Maybe it will be even worse there than here. No, it is much more logical, from the point of view of common sense and evolution. If the colonies is divided into several parts and scattered in different directions in search of the best option for its further existence, and if out of all the 5 to 6 swarms that came out, at least 1 to 2 swarms successfully survive, plus the remnants from the mother's colonies, which already have certain winter honey reserves from previous years, then this is already good, and bees as a species will never die out on Earth. This once again tells us how our nature is still wisely arranged. Taking this approach as a basis, namely, that swarming is the instinct of self-preservation of bees in nature, I have long since collected a complete list of reasons that can trigger the swarming process. I made a block diagram, in which I entered each individual reason in my block, and I got more than 30 such blocks. This is what my old draft looks like, which is more than 20 years old. Now, thanks to scientists, we know a lot about how the swarming process itself goes from the very beginning to its completion, i.e. where it all starts, what stages and stages it goes through. But until now we do not know exactly about the trigger for launching this important instinct. There are many studies by scientists on what exactly triggers the swarming process. I also have my own opinion on this question, and I came to this conclusion not immediately, but after much thought. No matter what reason I took from that flowchart, it always led me to the block in which poor nutrition of the uterus is recorded. In other words, as long as the nurse bees feed the queen abundantly and she actively produces eggs, the family has no problems, which means that the bees of this family do not need to start the process of swarming instinct, and she will successfully prepare for her wintering. Let me use an example to explain how this causal relationship works in a given instinct. There is a strong, well-balanced colony, which has plenty of free space for breeding and storing honey, with a good queen, and the time is not the best for bees, namely the end of May, the beginning of June. The mass flowering of the gardens is already over. The dead season has come. There is no nectar in nature, or there is very little of it. Forage bees practically do not work. The supply of nectar to the hive is minimal, which means that the young bees of the receptionist are also sitting without work. It is well known that winter stocks are there is, i.e. an inviolable stock. Bees can spend it only as a last resort and only for heating in winter, and that nurse bees feed exclusively on fresh nectar and pollen, and it will enter the hive very little. So in such a situation, they will sharply reduce the production of royal jelly, and as a result, they will begin to feed the queen less, and this will lead to the fact that she will begin to produce a special pheromone. Bees, having received such a signal from the queen, will begin to build drone cells, then lay queen cells, and so on throughout the chain. How to get such a colony out of the swarm state? Simply, it is necessary to urgently give such a colony a job to collect nectar. For example, take the apiary to another place where there is plenty of nectar, or give it feeders with sugar syrup. By resuming the flow of nectar to the hive or syrup, all normal processes are quickly restored in the colony, and the colony will come out of the swarm state. Another example, there is a strong, well-balanced colony, in which there is no free space for brood and storage of honey, and it is also with a good queen. Forage bees have the opportunity to bring a lot of nectar from some honeybees. But they will not do this. It has long been known that foraging bees stop working if the receiving bees no longer accept their nectar because there is nowhere to put it. They have a strict relationship, take just as much nectar that they can process, but no more. There will be a decrease in the supply of nectar, and this again, along the chain, will ultimately affect the fullness of the queen's feeding, and this in turn will necessarily work as a trigger, as in the case described above, to start the swarming process. How to get the colony out of the swarm state in this case? It is also simple. We must urgently give this colony a honeycomb for storing nectar and the queen's work to lay eggs. Does this mean that if you correctly determine the cause of swarming in a given colony, you can always have time to bring such a colony out of the swarm state? Theoretically, yes, it is possible. But in practice the beekeeper can make a mistake in finding the real reason and take measures of a completely different nature. But it is better not to allow such a situation at all and do everything in advance. And most importantly, you need to know all the possible causes that can theoretically lead a colony to swarm correctly and in time to be able to identify them, so that they can be eliminated in a timely manner. Beekeepers should adopt the Hippocratic principle, which says, eliminate the cause, and the disease will go away by itself, i.e. determine the true cause, eliminate it, and there will be no swarming. Conclusion. The swarming instinct is based on the instinct of self-preservation. It is he who pushes the bees to divide into parts in order to survive, and not the instinct of reproduction, in order to increase the number of bee populations in nature. The purpose of this video was 1. To show everyone how far we have fallen behind modern knowledge and still live in the past, clinging to myths invented by our ancestors. to convince everyone and prove that there is no reason to consider swarming as a natural instinct of reproduction, which means that swarming can not only be interrupted at the initial stage, but also prevented, and it is quite possible not to allow it at all. I will not describe or list all those reasons right now. This topic is very extensive and it will be available only to those beekeepers who want to take my advanced training course in my program. If you want to know and use my knowledge and ready-made experience, sign up for my paid courses. But you can also go all this way on your own, because I have already pointed you in the right direction, and you will decide for yourself what to do and how to live with it. If I have not convinced someone, please leave your comments under this video, and perhaps I will make the appropriate adjustments in the next edition. Thank you for listening to me to the end. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and share this video with your friends to discuss this topic with them. The next myth that I will analyze will be the myth about warm hives. I promise it will be even more interesting.
С ними эту тему. Следующим мифом, который я буду разбирать, будет миф про теплые улья. Обещаю, будет еще интереснее.